Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to get a little bit uncomfortable with me today?
Mhm.
We're diving into some pretty dense research on endocrine-disrupting chemicals.
EDCs for short.
Yeah,
Yeah.
EDCs. I think we all have a feeling that these are not good for us, but I have a feeling after
Yeah.
doing this deep dive, we're going to realize they're even worse than we thought.
Absolutely.
So just a quick reminder, all of the research that we're talking about today will be linked in the show notes. So if you want to follow along or do your own deep dive, be sure to check those out. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, what exactly are EDCs and why should we even care about them?
Well, EDCs are basically chemicals that can interfere with your hormones.
Okay.
And your hormones are kind of like these chemical messengers that control a lot of important functions in your body.
Right, like everything from growth and development to reproduction and metabolism, right? That's
Exactly.
like your body's intricate communication system.
Yeah, like a complex network.
Yeah.
And EDCs can come in and disrupt those signals.
So they can mimic hormones, block hormones, or even mess with how hormones are made and broken down, right? It's like they're throwing a wrench into this finely tuned system.
Exactly. And that can have all sorts of downstream effects on our health.
Okay, so we're talking about a wide range of potential health problems. But before we get into that, I'm curious about something. This research mentioned that ADCs don't just act on those familiar nuclear receptors scientists have been studying for years, right?
Right.
They can mess with our hormones in a bunch of other ways.
Right.
It's more complex than we initially thought, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's like, we used to think of EDCs as simply binding to these specific receptors, but now we're realizing that they can act through all sorts of different pathways.
So they can act through non-steroid receptors,
Right.
transcriptional coactivators,
Mm-hmm.
enzymatic pathways, and even get the gut microbiota?
Yes, even the gut microbiota. It's amazing, really. So many interconnected systems in our bodies.
Okay, wait a minute. Hold on. The gut microbiota, you mean the trillions of bacteria living in our gut? They're involved in this hormone destruction too.
Exactly. Think of it as a bustling ecosystem, and EDCs can come in and disrupt that balance.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. It
Mhm.
really shows you how everything is interconnected in our bodies. It's not just a single organ or system, it's a whole network.
It really is.
Okay, and speaking of connections, this research goes into this unsettling concept of transgenerational effects too.
Right. That's one of the most concerning aspects of EDCs.
Yeah, basically what it's saying is that exposure to EDCs can cause changes that are passed down to future generations, even if they were never directly exposed to those chemicals.
Exactly. And we're talking about changes that can impact their health, their development, even their fertility.
So even if I avoid certain chemicals, my kids or grandkids could still be dealing with the consequences of my past exposure.
That's the scary part. Yes, it's like a ripple effect.
Okay, I need you to break that down for me a bit. I was reading about DNA methylation, histone modification, and non-coding RNAs. What are those exactly, and how do they play into all of this?
Sure. So think of your DNA as a giant instruction manual for your body. And these epigenetic mechanisms like DNA methylation and histone modification, they can kind of annotate that instruction manual. They can add little notes or flags that tell your cells which genes to read and which ones to ignore.
So it's not changing the actual DNA sequence, right? It's more like changing the way the genes are expressed.
Exactly. You got it.
And how do non-coding RNAs fit into all this?
Well, those are like little messengers that can also influence gene expression. EDCs can mess with all of these processes.
It really makes you think about the long-term consequences. It's not just about us, it's about the generations that come after us.
Absolutely.
So we've established that these EDCs can disrupt our hormones in a bunch of different ways, and they can even affect future generations.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean for our health? What kind of diseases are we talking about here?
Well, the research breaks it down by body system, and it's a pretty long list. Let's start with the reproductive system, which is often the first thing people think about with EDCs.
Yeah, it seems like reproductive disorders are a major concern. This research mentions a wide range of problems in both men and women, everything from fertility issues and an increased risk of certain cancers to things like precocious puberty,
Mm-hmm.
endometriosis, PCOS in women,
Yes.
and cryptorchidism and testicular dysgenesis syndrome in men. That's a mouthful.
It is, yeah.
And there's pretty solid evidence linking specific EDCs to these conditions, right? Like, for instance, DES, that synthetic estrogen that was prescribed to pregnant women in the past.
Right. That's a classic example of how EDCs can have devastating effects on reproductive health. The daughters of women who took DES during pregnancy were found to have an increased risk of a rare vaginal cancer.
Wow, it's crazy to think that something that was once considered safe could have such long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of understanding the potential long-term effects of these chemicals.
And the concerning effects of EDCs don't stop at reproductive health. They also have a significant impact on our metabolism, right? This research links EDCs to metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and even obesity.
That's right.
I guess it makes sense since hormones play such a huge role in regulating how our bodies process energy.
Exactly. EDCs can interfere with those hormonal signals, leading to all sorts of metabolic problems. And what's even more fascinating is that some EDCs are classified as obesogens because they can directly interfere with fat metabolism.
Wait, obesogens? What are those?
So obesogens are chemicals that can actually promote weight gain and increase the risk of obesity. They can disrupt the way our bodies store and burn fat.
Wow, so it's not just about what we eat and how much we exercise. These chemicals can actually make it harder for us to maintain a healthy weight.
It's a complex interplay of factors, but EDCs definitely play a role.
That's pretty unsettling to think about.
It is, yeah.
It's not just about immediate, obvious effects. It's also about these subtle, long-term changes that are happening beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes EDCs so challenging to study. The effects might not be immediately apparent.
It's like they're silently undermining our health.
In a way, yes.
Okay, so we've talked about reproductive health and metabolism. What about our brains? This research suggests a possible link between EDCs and neurological issues too, right?
That's right. We're talking about things like cognitive difficulties, abnormal social behavior, lower IQs, and even psychiatric disorders.
And I read that the developing brain is particularly vulnerable to EDC exposure, right?
Yes, absolutely. During those critical periods of brain development, EDCs can have a profound impact on cognitive function and behavior. It's one of the areas of research that I'm most interested in right now.
So we're talking about effects that could last a lifetime.
Potentially, yes. We're still learning a lot about the long-term neurological effects of EDCs.
This is heavy stuff. I mean, it's pretty scary to think about all the ways these chemicals could be affecting us and future generations.
I know, it can be overwhelming. But knowledge is power, and the more we understand about EDCs, the better equipped we are to make informed choices.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've talked about reproductive health, metabolism, and neurological effects.
Yeah.
Are there any other major health concerns linked to EDCs?
Well, the research also mentions cardiovascular disease as a potential concern. Long-term exposure to certain EDCs, like BPA and phthalates, has been associated with an increased risk of heart problems.
Oh, wow. So it really is a wide range of potential health issues.
It is, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of understanding the full impact of EDCs on our health.
It's a lot to take in. So we know that these EDCs can disrupt our hormones in a bunch of different ways, and they can even affect future generations. And we've talked about some of the major health concerns linked to EDC exposure. But I'm curious, what are some of the specific chemicals we should be most concerned about?
That's a great question. There are literally thousands of chemicals out there that have the potential to disrupt our hormones. But let's focus on some of the key culprits mentioned in this research.
Okay, sounds good.
So we've got pesticides like DDT, DDE, endosulfans, methoxychlor, vinclozolin, atrazine, heavy metals like arsenic, lead, and mercury. Diethylstilbestrol, or DES, as you mentioned earlier, bisphenols like BPA, BPS, BPB, BPF, phthalates, oh, there's so many phthalates, DEHP, DNP, DNCH, DEA.
Okay, I'm already getting lost in the alphabet soup here.
I know, right? It can be overwhelming. But the point is that these chemicals are everywhere. They're in our food, our water, our air, the products we use every day.
It's pretty daunting to think about.
It is, but don't despair. The good news is that we can take steps to reduce our exposure and protect our health. And that's what we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, good, because I'm definitely feeling a little overwhelmed right now. I need some actionable advice.
You got it. We'll talk about practical tips and strategies for minimizing your exposure to EDCs and protecting yourself and your family.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I know our listeners are probably feeling a bit like information overload at this point.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about what we can actually do to mitigate the risks posed by these hormone-disrupting chemicals.
Sounds good to me.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break. Don't go anywhere.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so I think we left off talking about the huge list of EDCs out there.
Yeah, it can feel like a bit much, can't it?
It really can.
But don't worry, we don't have to memorize the entire periodic table.
Right. But maybe, where do we even start? What are some of the big ones that we're likely to encounter in our daily lives?
Okay, so let's start with those pesticides we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
DDT, DDE, things like that.
Yeah, those always sound so scary.
Well, they do have a pretty bad reputation, and for good reason.
So what's the deal with those?
Well, they're known to mimic estrogen in the body.
Estrogen, like the female hormone.
Exactly. And that can disrupt hormonal balance, especially in women.
So what kind of problems can that lead to?
We're talking about things like fertility issues, irregular periods, even an increased risk of certain cancers.
That's pretty serious stuff.
It is. And what's even more concerning is that these pesticides can linger in the environment for a long time.
Oh, right. Like, even if they're banned, we could still be exposed to them.
Exactly. They can accumulate in the soil, the water, even in our food.
That's unsettling to think about.
It is, yeah. It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of not just what we're directly exposed to, but also the overall health of our environment.
Okay, so pesticides are definitely on the watch list. What about heavy metals? I know those are bad news too.
Oh, absolutely. Heavy metals are another major class of EDCs, and they can wreak havoc on our bodies.
Like arsenic, lead, mercury, those kinds of things, right?
Exactly. And the thing about heavy metals is that they can build up in our tissues over time.
So even small exposures can add up.
Right, and that can lead to a whole range of health problems.
Like what?
Well, arsenic, for example, is a known carcinogen.
That's scary.
It is. And lead, as you probably know, is especially harmful to children's developing brains.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It can cause learning disabilities and behavioral problems
Exactly. And mercury is another big concern, especially for pregnant women.
because it can affect the developing fetus.
Right. It can damage the nervous system and lead to developmental delays.
Wow. That's a lot to think about, especially for parents or those planning to have kids.
It is, yeah. It's a good reminder to be mindful of the sources of heavy metals and take steps to minimize your exposure.
Okay, so we've talked about pesticides and heavy metals. What about those bisphenols we mentioned earlier, specifically BPA?
Ah, BPA, the poster child for EDCs.
Yeah, it seems like it's in everything.
It pretty much is. You'll find it in food packaging, water bottles, even cash register receipts.
And what's the big deal with BPA?
Well, it's been linked to a whole host of health problems, from reproductive issues and metabolic disorders to even some cancers.
And I remember reading that even low doses of BPA can have an effect.
That's right, especially during those critical periods of development, like in the womb or early childhood.
So it's especially important for pregnant women and young children to limit their exposure.
Absolutely. BPA can mimic estrogen in the body, and that can disrupt the delicate hormonal balance, especially during those crucial developmental stages.
And what about all those BPA-free products that are popping up everywhere? Are those actually safer?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It seems too good to be true.
Right, and unfortunately, the research suggests that some of those BPA-free alternatives might not be much better.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're often structurally similar to BPA, and they can have similar effects on our hormones.
So just because it says BPA-free doesn't necessarily mean it's safe.
That's the takeaway here. It's important to be aware of all the different bisphenols out there and to reduce your exposure as much as possible.
Okay, that's good to know. It's frustrating that we have to be so vigilant about these things, but I guess that's the reality we live in.
It is, yeah. It's a reminder to be an informed consumer and to make conscious choices about the products we bring into our homes.
Okay, so we've covered pesticides, heavy metals, and bisphenols.
Yeah.
What's next on our list of EDC culprits?
Let's talk about phthalates.
Phthalates. Those are those plasticizers, right?
Exactly. They're used to make plastics more flexible and durable.
And I think I've read that they're in a ton of different products like cosmetics, personal care items, even some toys.
You got it. They're pretty ubiquitous, unfortunately.
So what kind of health concerns are linked to phthalates?
Well, like many EDCs, they've been linked to reproductive problems, metabolic disorders, and even developmental issues in children.
And are there any specific phthalates that we should be particularly aware of?
DEHP is a big one. It's one of the most commonly used phthalates, and it's been linked to a range of reproductive problems in men, like reduced sperm count and quality.
Oh, wow, that's concerning.
It is. And there are other phthalates, like DINP and DINCH, that are often used as substitutes for DEHP, but they've also been linked to hormonal disruption.
So it's like we're trading one problem for another.
In some cases, yeah. And then there's DEHA, which is commonly found in cosmetics and personal care products.
So reading labels is definitely key here.
Absolutely. Look for products that are labeled as phthalate-free whenever possible.
Okay, good advice. It's really eye-opening to learn about all these different EDCs and how they can affect our health.
It is, yeah. It can be overwhelming at first, but knowledge is power. Once you start to understand the risks, you can start making more informed choices.
Okay, so we've talked about pesticides, heavy metals, bisphenols, and phthalates. Are there any other major EDCs that we haven't covered yet?
Let's touch on a couple more that are mentioned in this research.
Okay.
Dioxins are a big one. They're highly toxic environmental pollutants that can persist in the environment for a long time.
Dioxins. I've heard of those, but I don't really know much about them. What makes them so dangerous?
Well, they can disrupt hormone signaling and have been linked to a range of health problems, including reproductive issues, immune system dysfunction, and even cancer.
Cancer. Wow, that's serious.
It is, and there's a particularly toxic form of dioxin called TCDD that's been classified as a human carcinogen.
So it's definitely something to be concerned about.
Absolutely. And then there's nonylphenol, which is another EDC that's found in a lot of different products, from industrial detergents to pesticides.
Noliphenol. Okay.
It's known to have estrogenic effects, which means it can mimic the hormone estrogen in the body.
So similar concerns to BPA.
Right. It can disrupt hormonal balance and has been linked to reproductive problems and developmental issues.
Okay, so it seems like pretty much every chemical we've talked about has the potential to interfere with our hormones in some way.
Unfortunately, that's the case with many of these EDCs.
It's a lot to process.
It is, yeah. And it's important to remember that we're often exposed to multiple chemicals at the same time, not just one in isolation.
Right, so it's not always easy to pinpoint exactly which chemical is causing which problem.
Exactly. It creates a complex web of exposures, and that can make it challenging to study the effects of EDCs.
So how do scientists even go about studying something as complex as EDC exposure?
Well, cohort studies are a powerful tool.
Cohort studies.
Yeah, those are studies where researchers follow a group of people over a long period of time and track their health outcomes in relation to their exposure to different factors like EDCs.
So they can see if there are any patterns or associations between exposure and disease.
Exactly. But cohort studies have their limitations.
Oh, really? What kind of limitations?
Well, for one thing, people vary a lot in how they metabolize and respond to chemicals.
So what might cause problems for one person might not affect another person the same way.
Exactly. And that can make it tricky to draw definitive conclusions about cause and effect.
So it's not always black and white.
Right. It's often more nuanced than that. And that's why well-designed studies are so important. They need to be large enough and account for all these different variables.
Okay, so it sounds like research on EDCs is really challenging.
It is, yeah. But it's also incredibly important. We need to understand the risks posed by these chemicals so you can make informed decisions about how to protect our health.
So where do we go from here? What can we actually do to minimize our exposure to EDCs and protect ourselves and our families?
That's a great question, and one that we'll delve into right after this short break.
Okay, perfect. Because I think we're all ready for some practical advice.
Hang tight, we'll be right back. All right, so let's dive into some practical tips for reducing your exposure to EDCs. Ready?
Definitely hit me with your best advice. I'm all ears.
Okay, well, first off, let's talk about plastics. Those are a major source of EDCs, so reducing your use of plastics is a great place to start.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that means ditching the plastic water bottles and food containers.
Exactly. Opt for reusable options made from glass or stainless steel whenever possible.
Got it. What else?
Another big one is to pay attention to the ingredients in your personal care products and cosmetics.
Oh, yeah, those can be sneaky sources of EDCs.
You're telling me. Look for products that are labeled as paraben-free and phthalate-free.
I'm definitely going to start paying more attention to labels.
And, think about swapping out those harsh chemical cleaners for more natural alternatives.
Good point. I never even thought about that.
Right.
What about our food? Any tips for minimizing EDC exposure through our diet?
Absolutely. Choosing organic produce whenever possible can help reduce your exposure to pesticides.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah. Always wash your fruits and veggies thoroughly. Even if you're not eating the skin, it helps remove some of the residue.
Good reminder. Oh, and what about those obesogens we talked about earlier? Is there anything we can do to counteract those?
A healthy, balanced diet is always a good idea. Lots of fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And, limit those processed foods and sugary drinks.
Okay, so basically, just good old-fashioned healthy eating habits.
You got it. Taking care of your overall health is one of the best things you can do to protect yourself from the harmful effects of EDCs. It helps your body detoxify more efficiently.
Okay, that's empowering to know.
Yeah.
We're not just sitting ducks here.
Right. We have some control over this.
And, beyond making these individual choices, we can also advocate for change on a larger scale.
Absolutely. Support policies that promote stricter regulation of EDCs and encourage the development of safer alternatives.
Right. Make our voices heard.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has definitely been eye-opening. It's a lot to think about, but it's so important that we're having these conversations.
I agree. Awareness is the first step.
EDCs are a serious threat to our health and the health of future generations. But we don't have to just sit back and accept it. We can take action to protect ourselves and our families.
Absolutely. And remember, even small changes can make a big difference.
Well said. So, to wrap things up, what's the most important takeaway you want our listener to remember today?
EDCs are everywhere. They're sneaky and they can have a big impact on our health. But by understanding the risks, making informed choices, and speaking up for change, we can create a healthier future for ourselves and for generations to come.
So well said. Knowledge is power, and now that we know about this, we can start making changes. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of EDCs. For everyone listening, be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the research we discussed. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and take care of yourselves.